Hi, everybody. So last time we were talking about evidence of evolution, why on earth anybody would actually think that species change over time. Never mind how it happens, just the fact that anybody would think we need an explanation for how it happens, that it would happen at all. And one of the sources of evidence is fossils, right? We go marching along the ground and we come across this bone or evidence of a species that no longer exists. And there it is, and it's similar to species that exist today. Fossils. The other thing that we think of when we think of evidence of evolution is similarities between species. If you have two species that look a lot alike, it suggests that they inherited their genes from a common ancestor, just like if you see two people walking down the hallway and they look a lot alike, you think they inherited their genes perhaps from the same parents, that they're sisters or brothers or sister and brother siblings. Just like that, you might see two species that look a lot alike, and it suggests that they inherited their genes from a common ancestor, not the same parents or grandparents or great-great-grandparents. Going to go way back, right, to find that common ancestor, but it does suggest that. So similarities of species suggest common ancestry, that they have the same relatives. And the sciences that have looked at whether there are similarities between species are called comparative sciences. So anytime that we have a science studying any particular thing, if it's looking at two different species, we're going to put the adjective comparative in front of it. So for example, if you're looking at anatomy, we did that when we looked at the digestive system and we looked at the mouth and the pharynx and the esophagus and the stomach and the small intestine. We looked at all those structures. When you study structures, you're studying anatomy. But if you're comparing the stomach and small intestine of a cow to the stomach and intestine of an antelope, you're now performing comparative anatomy. You're comparing the anatomy of two species, anatomy being the structures, comparative two different species. You might not just compare anatomy. We've seen there are other things besides similar bones in the birds and the dinosaurs, similar stomachs or similar brains. There's other evidence that species can look a lot alike and maybe have inherited their genes from a common ancestor. One is looking at their proteins and their DNA. So you can study comparative biochemistry. Remember, we talked about biochemistry with proteins and lipids and carbohydrates. If you're studying all the lipids and carbohydrates and proteins in one species and the lipids and carbohydrates and proteins in another, you're now doing comparative biochemistry. There are other things that are similar between species besides their DNA and proteins and their structures. Another is looking at their fetuses and their embryos. It's amazing the similarities you can see among different embryos, and we'll look at that in a moment. Okay, so we're going to start with comparative anatomy. Now remember, anatomy is studying the structures, and if you're looking at it in two different species, you're doing comparative anatomy. Now, if we take a look at the pictures here, we have bones. This is a human arm used for picking things up, right? We've got all the bones, the phalanges in our fingers, and we've got the carpals and metacarpals in the hand and wrist, and then we have these bones up here. We've got all these bones. Well, it turns out if we look at those bones, just looking at us, that would be anatomy. But if we're going to do comparative anatomy, we might look at a horse leg and find that we have actually very similar bones, all laid out in very similar ways. We can look at the cat leg. That's really similar to a human arm. And here, this is crazy. This is a bat wing. And you can see that it has the same bone that we have up here. It has the two bones down here. It's got fingers and a thumb that have a big membrane across it and make a wing. The bird wing even is very, very similar. There's obviously some differences, just like the horse's leg. These two are a little more different. That suggests that we aren't as closely related. That suggests that our common ancestor was longer ago. Even a whale flipper, you don't think that that would have all the different parts of a human arm, but there it is. You've got the bone that's like our upper arm bone. You've got the two bones down below that are like the lower arm. You've got the fingers right inside of the flipper. So we can have structures that are similar in their shape, even if they do a different function, and those are called homologous. We talked about the word homologous before when we had homologous chromosomes. The word homologous simply means similar. Not always do we find that structures are the same between two different species. Sometimes they are very structurally different, even if they do the same job. So for example, you can have a wing of an insect and the wing of a bird. Very different. The bird's got bone and muscle and feathers, very different than the exoskeleton, the chitin that makes up the wing of an insect. And then there's vestigial structures. Vestigial structures, we talked about one vestigial structure in the digestive system. Vestigial structures are structures without any function at all. Now that is definitely strong evidence for evolution. Why? Because why would you have a structure that has no function except that you inherited genes for it? And why would you have inherited genes for something you have no function if it wasn't for the fact that maybe your ancestors had a function? And that suggests your ancestors were different than you. The vestigial structure that we talked about in the digestive system was the appendix. These are structures that have no function at all, but are similar to structures that have function. So we have basically, with comparative anatomy, we've got homologous structures, similar shape, but different function. Analogous structures, same function, different structure. And then we have vestigial structures, no function at all. The vestigial structure that we have here is looking at that little thing that comes off. That's the appendix that we saw in humans. And then when we looked at the appendix of the rabbit and the koala, who were herbivores, had a really long appendix called a cecum, and it has a function, breaking down plants. And so that, again, this is homologous to this, but now in us it has no function, so it's considered vestigial. And that's some powerful evidence that us and rabbits have a common ancestor, that we inherited our genes for those structures from the same ancestor. Here's another vestigial structure. This one's in a whale. Now remember, the whale flipper is very similar to our arm. Well, they're inside their body, they have a bone that has no function at all, which is really similar to our pelvis. So we believe that whales and dolphins have descended from an animal that was much like a dog, and that they have the genes for legs, well, for the pelvis, that they inherited from their ancestor that they no longer need. Now that seems crazy, right? You're like, no, this is crazy. This evolution stuff's a little nuts. How could a whale come from a dog-like creature? That's nuts. But I suggest that you consider thinking about an animal that exists today that's really similar to both a whale and a dog. Can anybody think? Can you think of anything that is really similar to a whale and a dog? In fact, it barks like a dog, and it swims and has flippers. Seals, right? Seals look a lot like whales, and they also look a lot like dogs. And if you start to think about that, you might consider that, yes, there might have been a transition organism between dogs and whales and dolphins. That is not to say that whales are the descendants of seals. They both exist today. They are cousins with a common ancestor that they share with the dog. Okay, so that's comparative anatomy. That's comparing the structures of two different species. Now we're going to compare something else, biochemistry. And if you look at proteins and DNA from various species, you will see amazing similarities that you would never have guessed. For example, I mentioned this before, humans and the bonobo chimps share 98.9% of their DNA. It's identical. That's crazy. You can't do that by accident. And that really does suggest that we've inherited our genes from a common ancestor. Now, how that happens, we haven't talked about yet, but it's strong evidence that it does happen, and we need an explanation for that. And even cows, you can see here we have 80% of our DNA is shared with cows. That suggests that cows are our cousins and we have a common ancestor with them from whom we inherited our DNA. We share something like 25% of our DNA with bacteria. Every single living thing on the planet seems to have a common ancestry now. Bacteria and us, you have to go back way, way, way further in time for our common ancestor than you would for us and the bonobo chimp, and certainly than you and your sibling. The last group of evidence, so we had comparative anatomy, and we have comparative biochemistry. We also have comparative embryology. And I just put in here a picture of various embryos, and you can see how similar they are. If you take a look, you have the fish and the salamander. I can't tell the difference between a chicken and a human embryo at this early stage. We have gills, as I talked about in the past. There's an awful lot of genes that we have that we're expressing, a tail and webbed fingers through our development. We have genes for gills. We obviously don't have gills by the time we're born, but we have the genes for them, and they're expressed during our embryological development. That suggests that we inherited them from an ancestor that we share with the fish. And I just tossed this picture back in for you guys. We looked at this before with fetal development, but you can see that the human embryo definitely does not look human. It looks a lot more like the salamander at that point. So what we're left with at this moment is that there's very clear evidence that species change over time. And so we're left with the big question mark, how the heck does that happen? And that's what the rest of this unit will be about.